I would request Dr. Michael Jensen to please start the session. Thank you.
Dear Ms. Chair, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very big pleasure to be here today, to have been invited by Dr. Lashari and the government. I came the first time on 1970 here, so it's almost 50 years, which is almost my whole life, which in a way, more or less, I spent in this area with the site and with the people of Mohen Jo Daro. And forgive me if at the beginning I am a little bit personal, but I think it's the historic right moment to thank all my staff who has been working with me between 1979 and 1987 in the German research project Mohen Jo Daro, where we redocumented the whole site, developed techniques of non-destructive archaeology together with Professor Maurizio Tosi and Dr. Cuccarzi from Italy, where new ways for doing archaeology were shown. Because since 1973 till to today, there is an excavation ban on Mohen Jo Daro by UNESCO. You are not allowed to excavate because rightly the world community says we only can continue working once we know how the structures and the site are safe. Allow me in the beginning to make a short comment on my dear colleague Mark Kenoyer's remarks on Mohen Jo Daro yesterday. You see on the left side, you see an aerial photograph taken 1980 of the stupa mount, and a little bit further down you see the great bath, and even down there is the great granary. Most of these sites were excavated between 1922 and 1931. In the beginning, the first 2-3 years by Banerjee and other archaeologists from the Archaeological Survey of India. And everybody knows this story when Marshall identified very similar items from Harappa and Mohen Jo Daro. He wrote his very famous article in the Illustrated London News 1924. It's not every day the right and the chance for an archaeologist to announce a newly discovered civilization of the world. This was the run on Mohen Jo Daro, which lasted only to the 30s. Then the 30s had some problems. We were in the preparatory work for World War II, and as a result, in the end, Sir Mortimer Wheeler was the last Director General of Archaeology in the Archaeological Survey of India. But what I want to discuss with you are these two structures. At first, what we nowadays call a stupa, and I want to show you, the fourth person on the left is Giovanni Verardi. He is Italian and he is expert for Buddhism, normally working in the north. By the way, the second one is Ute Franke. She unfortunately could not come. We have Massimo Vidale, Cuccarzi. You see many people of those of this team who have been worked, also Mark, everybody was here with us in Mohen Jo Daro. So this stupa, and that was the identification by Giovanni Verardi, is no stupa. It clearly has been proved that this is a Harappan structure. We have to rethink the whole conception of architecture in relation to the citadel. Now, Mark was the opinion that we should excavate and remove it, and of course, as it is a Harappan structure, we should not. and it has been excavated already in the 20th. Here you see the drawings in Marshall's excavation of Mohen Jo Daro. You see on the left side the ground plan and a cross section, and on the right side you see the excavations which were carried out around the so-called stupa in this platform on which you can work today. That means they went down for almost 10-15 meters, and if you would excavate nowadays there, you would find nothing else but the fill of those days. Here we see one of the old photographs, and you may be aware that the German research project Mohen Jo Daro has the largest collection of historic photographs on Mohen Jo Daro, more than 4,000, which were taken in the 20th by the British and the Archaeological Survey of India. And you see the stupa, and you see the basis, already 1923-24, has been conserved. It's another problem I will come to, and you see on the front side the deep diggings which went down almost to the ground of the plain around. Another question is the Great Bath. And here you see the advantage of the old photography. On the top you see the original non-conserved structure of the Great Bath, and below you see how it looks like today. 80% of the Great Bath is new. And this was one comment yesterday. It makes no sense to rebury something which is new. So we have to know what is original and what is not original in Mohen Jo Daro, because we as experts, if I see a wall, the technology of how the wall was constructed, you can date. You easily can differentiate between early Harappan, mature or late Harappan structures, and this technique should be further developed, because also in other sites of the Indus Valley we might be able to date not only by pottery and C14 but by technology of the wall construction. So this Great Bath, and here you see one of our low altitude photogrammetric photographs. You see the Great Bath. Do we have a pointer or something like that? No. I just go there and I come back to the microphone. This is the outlet, and you see it goes around the so-called granary. It turns the granary. We have another unpublished plan by Wheeler, which he did in 1950, and it is very clear that the Great Bath was sunk into urban ground rather late. You see the outlet, everybody knows it. It's very famous because the tank is 2 meters deeper than the surrounding areas. So there is a chamber where Marshall thought this was for escaping for the people, but in fact it is the difference of height of the outlet 2 meters deeper and the surrounding passage passing it. And it goes around the granary, and the granary is a much older structure. And you know, also today, there is no proof to follow Wheeler's interpretation of a granary. We had a similar interpretation yesterday by Mark relating the granary in Harappa. This is very important, because Wheeler was the one in his publication, 1968, to say the idea of the Indus civilization was imported from Mesopotamia. Still 1968. And with this hypothesis, he transferred economy and religious behavior from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, and that is why he called this little figure priest king, and that is why he thought this is a granary based on centralized economies which were known in Mesopotamia. We know nowadays that even if it would be a centralized storage, centralized economy, it would be much too small for this gigantic city of Mohen Jo Daro. So also here I would kindly request not to remove it and look what it is under. from the conservation point, it's very important because the floor, you see now when you go to the site, the floor of the Great Bath is not older than 30 years. The original floor is underneath, and they replaced the old, no, they not replaced, they covered, thanks heaven, protectively, the old floor through a new one. Now, why is this question of old and new so important? I will comment on that. Here you see an unpublished map of Wheeler, which we obtained 15 years ago from England, and you see the granary in this sketch. I'm sorry, it's still not working. I'm a little bit stupid. And you see on the top, you see a line going up to the north. This is the remain of the drain from the Great Bath. And you see something else. This is the loading platform. I will go there. You may identify and remember what we saw yesterday. The loading bay cannot be a loading bay because there is a well just in front of it. I will show you. And Wheeler simply ignored it in his publication 1968. This is the loading bay, and you see the well as a circle. So the Great Bath indeed is a later structure, and to analyze the chronology, the relative chronology, will be very interesting. There's one more important part. The Great Bath is the only structure in the whole Indus civilization which is sealed with bitumen. We have no idea where the bitumen is coming from, but the whole tank is set into 4 to 5 centimeters bitumen. So later structure, bitumen, and it seems to be, according to our observation of the stratigraphy, that the stone figures in Mohen Jo Daro coincide with a later period. They are not from the early mature Harappan strata. So there is a whole complex of big riddles which might turn or point towards the west, at least bitumen sources, if they could only come from the western areas. Let us come to the third point. Here you see one of the wells. And now you can understand, if you watch the brick structures, I could immediately tell you now which one is new and which is old. And you know, this is the Mackay excavation DKG. And when he started, the spill was on top, and slowly he went down. Now watch the well in the upper part, and watch it in the lower part. Complete different technology. This is how we can date walls, by analyzing what you normally call a British bond. The technique in bricklaying is you never should have a vertical gap, because then the wall might be weakened, destabilized. And you can identify the morphology of the architecture through the fact that later walls are built against the older ones without any connection. This is how we can study the development, the growth, the morphology of the city itself. Now we come to the drains. Here we have a map, and you see all these circles are wells. I commented that already often, that Mohen Jo Daro, in the history of mankind, never in the world, has the highest density of wells with an enormous effort to construct them. We went down in one well 20 meters deep, and we did not reach the bottom of the well. So the shafts are sunk, and you see when they are excavated, they look like chimneys in the air. Now, in the early and mature period, all houses were connected with drains. Only in the late period, you have pots outside to collect the water, because they do not have the infrastructure anymore to maintain a proper drainage system, which of course is public cost. You see on the left side, this is Munir area, the outlet of the bath, and these jars, as we call them, soak pits, where the water is assembled and the sewage can be emptied. On the right side, you see the sketch of it. So, Normally drains in the lower levels are perfect. You see them everywhere with the outlets, and there are not pots used to collect the drain, but the drain itself is the affluent for the sewage water. Of course, architecture is only one indication to interpret the social behavior, residential behavior. This is a list, you can't read it, but we have 38,000 registrations in the field books of Mohen Jo Daro in the computer, which give us information in addition to the structural analysis about the functions. And of course, and here Mark is very right, they had definitely problems to identify something like kitchens, because in those days the technology was not advanced enough. But I mean, you have pottery which you can identify as kitchenware, things like that. In the joint efforts, still an enormous amount of data for the interpretation are available. Now we come to the campaign to 1965. You see a well, how it was excavated 1925. And here I want to point out the enormous invention of technology. It's not so much philosophical. I think it's very practical. The bricks you have in Mohen Jo Daro, we even have today in Germany. The same size, the same proportion, 1 to 2 to 4, and you can grip it with one hand. So this is a rationalized element. Now the second technical enormous step is, look at the wells. The circle is constructed by having these specific kind of cuneiform bricks, which give you a very stable lining for the bricks, sunk almost 20 meters down. So what we find in Mohen Jo Daro, and I think it's definitely also reflected in the technology, is a kind of minimalistic but high-tech, fully developed appearance which we have in Mohen Jo Daro up to now. We have no earlier stages where we have the Romans in Germany. They had squarish wells, and the side walls collapsed because the side pressure was too high. Here, not a single well can collapse, because the more side pressure you have, the more stable is this well. So what we are looking also in Mohen Jo Daro, what we are looking for is the predecessors of this technology. A brick with a size 1 to 2 to 4 and a cuneiform brick cannot just fall from heaven. We have the development in all other technologies, but we do not yet have it for the technology of the architecture. Well, we come to this 1973 conference. You see the photo down there. Of course, you have Cunningham, Wheeler, and 73 actually was already a much advanced stage for the UNESCO project. 65, as was even mentioned, was already visited by Plenderleith. Harry Plenderleith was the director of ICRAM in Rome. Professor Wood from Holland, and another one under Nedeco. And they developed the maps I will show you, and they did the first drilling in Mohen Jo Daro. 73, of course, was this great event, and on the left side you see Dr. Naqvi. Maybe the older colleagues from Pakistan still know him, who later became the first director of the cultural center in Paris. And in this connection with Dr. Naqvi in Paris and with Mr. Bhutto in Pakistan, this enormous campaign for more than $20 million in Mohen Jo Daro was feasible. Now, what is the UNESCO campaign? You see the site. So number one, of course, was conservation, to try to save the structures for not to be further destroyed. You have the groundwater control, and you see here, this is the collector drain, this line around. And when you leave the site, look at the left, you see it's in a not very good shape. The third one is the river control, and you see the bunds and the spurs going into the river. This was a 6 million project, and I have to I hear now Nilufer shouting and saying, like Jarish, the stones come from Rory. They were brought from Rory and they have destroyed all the Paleolithic sites in the Rories to save Mohen Jo Daro. The next one was landscaping, and you see Mohen Jo Daro is like a moon surface, but the surrounding fields are all very green. So due to the fact to lower the groundwater table, they turned the whole soil into a very saltish surface, which the less water you put in and the less plants you have, the more salty it gets. Then, of course, we have the master plan and the capacity building. I give you a few photographs which are normally not published. This is the way how they started with the control of the groundwater table. And you see that all the walls were opened for at least 40, 50 centimeters to introduce damp-proof courses to try to avoid humidity rising in the wall. What not often happened, but it happened, is that the whole wall, if it was lower, collapsed. So the question of authenticity and originality in those days was not the primary point of discussion. And you see how they introduce these damp-proof courses into the walls. About 80% of Mohen Jo Daro has been treated by this way, and you see on the right side a wonderful effect which is interesting for engineers. You see the damp-proof course. It is here. And this is the salt's concentration under the damp-proof course in a way that these whole bricks are eaten and the whole wall collapses. So there were technical problems in executing the program. You see on the left side the analysis of tenardite and mirabilit. I don't go too much in detail, but the destruction takes place in winter below 31 degrees, and the salts crystallize and they take from the night, from the air, the water, and they crash the capillaries, and that is the result on the left. In 1987, UNESCO said, we cannot continue like that. We have to rebury the site. And that was a good idea. And our experts, we all together developed a system where the whole site was covered under 3 to 4 millimeters of clay. Nowadays, when you go to the site is not red anymore. It is brown, it is clay, and we have the proof that 4,500 years ago the city looked like that. We have burnt plaster remains and so on. So with this, the crystallization of the salts takes place in the mud surface, which can be controlled and exchanged. So if you want to save Mohen Jo Daro still in the future, maintain it. Keep the slurries everywhere, control it. It's a question of maintenance and not of high technology. Another question was the surfaces, and here you see after the rains these huge gullies cut into the soil, and here one of the very important aspects was to cover the surfaces with 2 to 3 layers of clay bricks. This is what we did, and when you go to the citadel on top, you see the surface, it's like in every village, wonderfully clean, you can almost polish it. But most of the site, I have to say, is not maintained properly. In many rooms, these layers have gone, so reducing the dust surfaces by brick layers, protecting the walls by covering, then 80% of the work is done. This is a condition report we did for UNESCO in 2004. The red ones are the original endangered structures. And in those days it became clear, if we want to read in the walls like in a book, we have to keep the originality. And this has to be treated primarily. And then the new ones, because the new ones, if you rebuild it or not, it makes no big difference. It's as source, as archaeological source gone. And you see 80% of the citadel area is new. It's a little bit shocking, I know, and we also do not publish these photographs, All these maps, they are a part of an internal report of UNESCO, and you see the HR area, that there are more original structures, but also major parts already rebuilt. This is very important for the experts, because I tell you, I was with George Dales, I was in the site. He has written a report on Monir area, and he marks that the Harappans had very strange triangle openings, but indeed this was the walls, the bricks in the wall taken out by the conservation people to introduce the dam-proof courses, and it's very difficult to read what is original and what is not original. Therefore, for research, for the future, these evaluation structures are of greatest importance. Now we come to the groundwater problem, second UNESCO. You see, this is a publication of 1973. A is Mohen Jo Daro. B is the so-called new site, and you see the canals around with the dots, which are pumps to lower the groundwater table.